Dr. Jose Ramos Horta, thank you very much for speaking with the
Pleasure.
Institute for Societal Leadership. Now, activism seems to be in your blood. I mean, your father, your grandfather were exiled for speaking out against the Portuguese government. What was it like growing up in that kind of family?
Well, I would not say that it's in the blood or in the history of the family, because as growing up, I knew very little about my own father or grandfather's background in Portugal. But people, human beings, sometimes if you're sensitive, you have a soft heart. No one has to teach or educate you about how you feel about injustices, inequality. And as a child, I was always very sensitive to other people. And as a teenager, I became even more aware of injustices around me. The Portuguese colonial presence in Timor-Leste was very mild. There was no war there, and it was not like a prison camp. If anything, one can accuse of the Portuguese colonial rule in my country was indifference, negligence. They kept Timor-Leste only so that by letting it go, it would could set a precedent for the more important colonial crisis in Africa.
So you decided to speak up against the government?
Yes, very early on, I began to speak up, to write. Of course, the medium of communication there was, word of mouth, because we didn't have television or radio. So I would speak with many different groups, and then I end up once being interrogated and deported at age 19 or 20 to East Africa, to Mozambique. By being there in Mozambique, when I learned more about the fallacies of Portuguese colonialism, and of course back then in Mozambique there was already a growing insurgency against Portuguese colonial rule. It took only another 4 years. I was there in 71 when the Carnation Revolution took place in Portugal. And they put an end to the 50-year-old autocracy, dictatorship in Portugal. We were very young at the time, very inexperienced, but motivated by pride, idealism. We decided to seize on the opportunity provided by the Carnation Revolution, by the decision of the Portuguese themselves in relinquish the colonies, to demand, advocate for independence for Timor-Leste. Overwhelming majority of the people of Timor-Leste adhere to that. But this dream was short-lived because we had a brief civil war in August, September 75. But by December 75, Indonesian armed forces invaded Timor-Leste. Xanana Gusmão, then very much revered resistance leader, appointed me as his special envoy, special representative abroad.
How did you feel when they told you you need to leave to get international support for the independence of Timor, leaving your homeland, your loved ones?
Well, you have to be here, have a lot of illusion about yourself.
How so?
In a sense, here I am, inexperienced, with a broken English, sent to New York to advocate, to represent our struggle at the United Nations. That I accepted and went there. I say, I have some sort of illusion about myself, and yes, you can do it. So there I went, and I arrived in New York in the midst of the North American winter. I had never seen snow in my life. I stayed in that Tudor hotel, now Hilton, on 42nd and 2nd. Back then, I stay in the cheapest room, which was $20. I was introduced around in the UN and started lobbying the Security Council. I addressed the Security Council 4 times during that week of the debate on East Timor. To everybody's surprise, the Security Council, that was very divided throughout the Cold War on that particular issue of Indonesian intervention in Timor-Leste, it was a unanimous condemnation. That was also my first lesson in international hypocrisy. Those countries, all 15, voted for the demand of Indonesia's withdrawal from Timor-Leste. The 10 non-permanent members can be forgiven because they had very little or no power whatsoever. You have 5 permanent members. Of those 5, at the time, Russia and China had literally zero relation with Indonesia. France, minimum at the time with Indonesia. So the biggest partners of Indonesia was UK and US, and more US than. But that was the height of the Cold War, post height of Vietnam. US had just been forced out of Vietnam in humiliation. So they did vote for Indonesia withdrawal. However, US continued to supply weapons to Indonesia, enabling Indonesia to continue to defy the Security Council resolution. That's why I say my first lesson in international hypocrisy. And then I learned many lessons on international hypocrisy over the years.
Okay, so what did that teach you then? How?
But you just have to continue, stay focused on the work, be patient, swallow your pride when sometimes you are offended, you are humiliated by the hypocrisy, by arrogance of some diplomats, some countries. You know one thing, during all those years in US, in New York at the UN, when I was literally a nobody, the only diplomats from Asia, the only ones who really took time in sitting with me and listening to me, even inviting me for lunch, were Singaporean diplomats. Even though Singapore had this very important relationship with Indonesia, very delicate, nevertheless, at least they had the courtesy of treating me with respect and even invite me to lunch to listen to my side of the story about what's happening in Timor-Leste. The only African country that did that. Even when Singapore still voted with Indonesia. It was obviously understandable. It would be like almost suicidal for Singapore not to... Because in '75, in the first UN General Assembly resolution on Timor-Leste, Singapore abstained. So dissented from all the other ASEAN countries. And Indonesia was furious at the time. So you have to understand that later they joined with the rest of ASEAN. But they still listen to you. So this is a lesson of, how you say, diplomacy for people that you should listen to the underdog, people who claim justice, who want to be heard. So Singaporean diplomats in this regard, yes, they were great. And as you can see, I'm now much older, 40 years later, and I remember that with appreciation.
Did they give you any other assistance besides just listening to you?
No, back then, no, there was not much Singapore can do. But later, when the time came and history changed, Singapore was on the front line together with the UN in deploying troops, medics, police to Timor-Leste. And over the years, a lot of opportunities never negated to Timor-Leste was for training of civil servants, diplomats, etc. You know, I remember talking once with Gottschalk
Tong.
Tong,
Yep.
Prime Minister. He said something that remains valid for Singapore, is that Singapore doesn't provide grants, cash to anyone,
Handouts, yeah.
handouts, provide training. And absolutely correct. But what we learn is you can have abundance of wealth, but if you don't have a brain power, human resources, trained people, honest leaders, the money can be squandered and the people remain poor, and you create social inequalities and instability and violence. It has to do with good governance, good leadership, ethical leadership.
I want to bring you back to your time in the US for now. What was your most difficult time abroad?
In the beginning, in New York, getting adjusted to New York, to the UN, and difficult in communication with the back of the country. My whole family was behind. No news from any of them. So it's very lonely years. But never once I thought of giving up. Every time is some thought of that nature surface, but in the sense, to find a job, to work, to survive. I always thought of the trust it was placed on me by the leadership, my compatriots, and I could not fail them.
Well, in the mid-1980s, you began advocating dialogue with Indonesia. And in 1992, you put forward this peace plan. Why did you choose this path? I mean, Indonesia killed almost a third of the Timor population, and some of your family, even your loved ones, were killed by the Indonesians. So why did you decide peace was the way to go?
Yeah. That peace proposal, I crafted it after weeks, months of reflection, studying, looking at the different situations and options. I put up this three-phase peace proposal. It was in 3 stages that would have given Indonesia a dignified, honorable way out of Timor-Leste without further loss of lives to Timor and Indonesia. It was a pragmatic, well thought out proposal. It was that proposal that really influenced the Nobel Committee years later to award me the Peace Prize, besides my background of work, etc. And it is a classic situation of leaders do not knowing when to leave, when to seize an opportunity to find a peaceful, honorable exit from a particular situation. Had Indonesia leaders with greater vision seize on that, we would have a sit down and negotiate a relatively long roadmap that would result in a referendum many years later that probably would have been far more peaceful, a peaceful outcome than what happened in '99. So that's what I thought, when I drafted that peace proposal. Often in conflicts, why the Syria situation? Because everybody underestimated each other. The one thing that Indonesia did was totally underestimated the little Timorese people. By underestimating, Indonesia lost thousands of soldiers in Timor. We have cemeteries that are very well looked after in Timor-Leste. So it has to do with underestimating the other side.
Timor also lost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So how do you put aside that anger or that resentment from the violence that the Indonesians inflicted on Timor to advocate for peace?
Well, for background first, Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. In Asia, Timor-Leste is the most Catholic in terms of percentage. Philippines is 80%. We are 97% Catholic. And yet, in the course of our struggle, never we demonize Indonesians as a people. We always respect the people of Indonesia as a people. For 24 years in our struggle, we never touched an Indonesian civilian in my country. Not a single Indonesian soldier captured by the resistance was executed. After a few months, a year, two, depends, they were set on the road back to their army barracks. And that was our philosophy, our practice. Then situation changed in Indonesia, not of our making. We contributed to it, but Indonesian people, particularly students, went to the streets. So the Indonesians themselves were the ones that brought down the Suharto regime. Indonesians freed themselves from the Suharto, and by freeing themselves from the regime, they helped free Timor-Leste. So negotiations began with the UN for a quick transition. From day one of our independence, we start working with Indonesian leaders to normalize relations. We resisted the pressure to set up an international tribunal. We said no, Indonesia is experiencing a difficult transition. They themselves have just been liberated from dictatorship. If we were to impose, to force through a special tribunal, we would further destabilize Indonesia. It would make very difficult the management of the relation between us and Indonesia. Justice will happen, will take its course, but on Indonesia's own time. And the Indonesian side appreciate this, and that's why we have a great relationship, people to people and the official level.
It's quite a remarkable achievement.
An incredible achievement.
You were awarded the Peace Prize in 1996 for your efforts towards achieving an independence for Timor. What does the award mean to you?
First, I was surprised and embarrassed. I thought Bishop Belo, at the time, I was actually discreetly lobbying for him to get the prize. I didn't know that my name was also under consideration while I was discreetly, respectfully doing the lobbying for Bishop Belo. And I thought Xanana Gusmão himself. But the Nobel Committee decided to award me the prize. And I never thought of it, really, this is not false modesty. I care for Timor-Leste to be free. I didn't care about the Nobel Peace Prize. If Timor is to be free without the Nobel Peace Prize, so what? This is what is important. But I'm eternally grateful to the Nobel Committee in Oslo, because thanks to their decision, Timor-Leste's cause was on the front page on the international agenda. And that contributed enormously to facilitate the dialogue with Indonesia once the circumstances arose.
I found it interesting that in your speech, your acceptance speech, when you received the prize, you highlighted US President Roosevelt's message in 1939, just months before World War II, about moral rearmament. And you said that at the same time, when President Roosevelt was saying this, the US actually turned away 900 Jewish refugees from Germany. Why did you feel the need to highlight this, and what does this say to you about leadership?
Today, with the refugee crisis in Europe, it's so revealing about moral leadership. Europeans for hundreds of years in the past fled to what today is North America, US, Canada. For hundreds of years they flocked to South America from all over Europe. Europeans have been extraordinarily generous, over these many years, accommodating millions of people from their ex-colonies and elsewhere. The European Union was in the forefront of the advocacy for human rights and democracy. So I have a great respect for the European Union and the Europeans in that regard. But with the expansion of the European Union and with the countries from Central Eastern Europe joining the European Union with very different history of relationship with the Arab world and Africa, they are far more insensitive, less sensitive to migration and refugees. But fortunately, Angela Merkel, who was very much criticized, demonized over her handling of the Greek financial crisis, she has now taken the moral leadership in dealing with this issue. And she has to be applauded and commended. And so it is showing the importance of leaders, showing moral courage, political courage, in handling very difficult situations.
This issue of moral leadership, moral standing seems to be very important to you. In 2006, when you were foreign minister, there was this crisis in Timor with rebel soldiers, and you actually decided to resign because you said you felt that Mari Alkatiri, who was prime minister at the time, that he didn't have the moral standing to lead. Why is moral standing, moral leadership so important to you?
Leaders, being leaders, have to have a courage, compassion, humility. If you fail, you have to say, yes, I have failed. We failed the people in 2006. It was our collective failure as leaders. I resigned as a foreign minister. But soon after it lasted only a few days of my resignation, I was asked to serve as prime minister. So I served for 1 year more or less as prime minister. I made every effort to reconcile the country, to calm down the tensions slowly, with help from the UN and Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Portugal. The situation security-wise was pacified. And then we had elections, and I was asked to run for president, and I did, because I was asked to. I had to continue the process of healing the wounds, because for the government to govern, you have to have conditions of peace and security. And to do that, I engage in dialogue with everybody. You listen to people. So for me, qualities of leadership is, besides being smart, besides being intelligent, and intelligence doesn't come necessarily only from your academic background. How intelligent you are, you will not succeed if you are not humble, if you don't show compassion. For me, two greatest qualities of a leader is humility and the compassion. Humility, when you are strong, that's when you should be even more humble. When you are at the peak of power, of privileges, you should show humility. Come down from the mountains to meet the people at the valley. I have warned my country fellow leaders in meetings before the crisis in 2006. I said, we have to be humble. We have to listen to people. We have to reach out, particularly those who are not in power. Because I said governments often fall, not because of bad governments. Sometimes very competent, but heartless. Those who are leaders, and they have to have feelings. And often some good leaders, lead good in the sense of good technocrats, they produce results. They are not very popular because they are perceived to be arrogant. And sometimes the more successful they are in producing figures, the more arrogant they are. And one day people get tired of them. Some of the best examples of humble leader, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. These are some of the best, and unfortunately, very few examples.
Anybody in living memory at the moment?
Well, I have to say, for me, Lee Kuan Yew, for the circumstances of Singapore, as it was born, painful birth, in the midst of those Cold War challenges, Lee Kuan Yew did the right thing. Singapore wouldn't be what it is today if Singapore had a weak leader without vision and without firmness in dealing with the political, social security challenges at that time. He was a living figure. Well, he died recently, but his influence still very alive. A real giant. And imagine, Singapore, with due respect to my Singaporean brothers and sisters and cousins, is not exactly a major demographic power or territorial power. But Lee Kuan Yew's influence is felt all over the world.
Your time as president, one of the significant moments was that you suffered an assassination attack in 2008. But instead of, you actually pardoned the assassin and his accomplices, and you asked the country to forgive them, and you wanted reconciliation. Why?
The situation of 2008, where I was victimized, was the prolongation, the end of result of the 2006 political security crisis of Timorese leadership making. The 2008 situation, today in retrospect, knowing what I know, of course the gentleman who went to my house and did what he did, I knew him well, a lunatic character. And even though I was involved in talking with him, even as president, he came to my house unannounced and proceeded to disarm 2 soldiers who were there. But a 3rd soldier saw, was more alert, and fired 2 shots. He was killed. Then the fighting broke out, and I was away. I was doing my morning exercise. God wanted me to leave the house earlier than I usually did. Yeah, I left earlier. That particular morning I left earlier. And I would go out normally around 6, but the particular morning I went out like 5:30 or something like that. And when I heard the shots, I knew coming from my house, I went. When I was shot, the people who came to my house, the renegade soldiers, they were totally disoriented. When they heard that I had been shot, they were disoriented. Soon after, they issued a statement. When the president returned from hospital, we will surrender. So they did surrender a few days after I returned. All of them, not one. Of course, they were arrested. They surrendered, they taken to prison, they were tried. Some were sentenced to 14 years in prison. And then you have the presidential prerogative of evaluating, put everything in balance. And I said, well, they have been tried, sentenced, And now it's my turn to address this. Under our law, our constitution, I decided to pardon them off because these are small people. This would not have happened if leaders had not failed in 2006.
Well, it's been more than a decade since Timor has achieved its independence, but some people actually feel that the government has not delivered, that they haven't reaped the rewards of this independence. I mean, many healthcare services are not accessible to people in remote areas. Some 50% of children are malnourished. What is your take on that?
Some of the criticisms are valid. We could have done more, particularly with the money that is available to us from our own petroleum sovereign fund. But knowing what Timor-Leste was in 99, 2000, 2002, what country we inherited, what infrastructures, what basis of human resources, education, health we inherited in 2002, looking back, I would say we have achieved far more than most countries in similar circumstances and the longer independent states. Look, Timor-Leste is only 13 years independent, but if you look at the United Nations Human Development Report Index, Timor-Leste is far better, with all the indicators higher than all African countries, sub-Saharan, with the exception of South Africa and Cape Verde. Child mortality, infant mortality reduced by half already. By 2017, we will have more doctors as percentage of population than any country in Asia, with the exception of Singapore, Korea, Japan. You mentioned about malnutrition, yes, still a huge challenge. The government has been thoroughly incompetent in implementing the school feeding program. The budget is there. The government committed the money to provide a hot meal a day for every child in school in my country, something like 400,000 kids. But we cannot also make miracles and making everybody overnight competent, hardworking. Unfortunately, many of our officials, government leaders, ministers, have done a very poor job in two areas, education and health. We could have done far better. We should have done even better if there had been less corruption and less incompetence.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for speaking with us.